I'm very privileged to be able to introduce you to Doctors Michael Higgins and his conversation partner, Gary Warner. To be honest, to sum up the biographies of these two men in a few lines is a bit of a challenge. Their accomplishments would easily fill a couple of pages. So I just picked some highlights. And hopefully I will still do them justice. So, Dr. Gary Warner is a professor emeritus who taught courses at McMaster University on Francophone literature and on peace and international development, and held a wide variety of administrative roles. He served as director of the CUSO program in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and later as chair of CUSO's International Board of Directors. His service has been and is international, national, provincial, and local. He's been working for over 50 years on issues related to international development, peace, poverty, human rights, anti-racism, immigration, and social justice. Gary has been the recipient of a long list of awards, including the Order of Canada, and most recently, the Hamilton Senior of the Year Award. He's currently serving on the chair of the board of Good Shepherd Centers, the Catholic Children's Aid Society of Hamilton, and of course, on the board of Concerned Lay Catholics. He and his wife, Joy, live in Hamilton. They have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Dr. Michael Higgins is a native of Toronto, an author, scholar, educator, former senior academic administrator, Vatican Affairs specialist for the Globe and Mail, papal commentator for the CTV network. He is a distinguished professor of Catholic thought emeritus at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, senior fellow of Massey College, author of numerous academic studies and biographies, many award-winning and several translated into French, Italian, German, Norwegian, in case you want to get beyond English in reading his work. He is a regular contributor to The Tablet in London, Commonweal in the US, and the Globe and Mail here in Toronto. He is an award-winning CBC documentarian and has a doctorate in English literature, which is evident from his diction, as you will soon see. He is an affiliate professor of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio and is a past president of 3 Canadian Catholic universities, has been awarded 2 honorary doctorates. Today, I am privileged to often run into him on campus as he is serving as the Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. If you want to know more, you can check out his Wikipedia page. He and his wife, Christina, have 4 adult children. And in case I forget to tell you at the end, which I'll try to do again, Michael will be blogging every Friday from Rome. And if you would like to receive his blog posts and musings, which are very well worth reading, you can email him at michaelwhiggins48@gmail.com. I'll put that in the chat. This is free and appears every Friday morning. And so I will pass this on to Gary and Michael.
Okay, so I think I will lead off here, and thank you, Michael, for agreeing to this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. You bring such a wealth of experience and knowledge about the Vatican, about the papal history, which has been a passion of yours. I have a series of questions that I would like to ask you to animate this conversation. My first set of questions is aimed at understanding Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. So they probe mainly what motivates Pope Francis. The second set of questions will focus more on dominant issues of the day. There are about a dozen questions or so. We'll see how far we get into those questions. I'll begin with the title of your work, because you use the word disruptor several times to characterize Pope Francis, including in the title of this book, The Jesuit Disruptor, A Personal Portrait of Pope Francis. His critics, you say, are right in seeing him as the disruptor because he is that, and not just any disruptor. He is the Jesuit disruptor, and that defines him more than anything else in his biography. Jesuit and disruptor. Let's reflect on the word disruptor first. Could you expand for us on why you see this disruptor trait so central in your portrayal of Pope Francis that you chose it above other potential descriptors for the title of your book?
It's a good question, Gary. Certainly, I could have chosen the term the Jesuit subversive or the Jesuit revolutionary or the Jesuit rebel or any number of comparable synonyms. I chose disruptor partly because of the ambiguity around it. Disruptor, ER, spelled ER, is largely a pejorative term. We think of a disruptor as somebody in the classroom, somebody who's upsetting people and whatnot. With OR, disruptor OR tends to have a much more benign meaning, somebody who's innovative, who unsettles because they have a pioneer consciousness or something like that. It's often used among scientists and those working in technology, kind of an innovative role. Now, I chose it partly for that reason, but also for the ambiguity, because it's a double-edged sword, really. He disrupts the way we've done things. When you think, first of all, of his very appearance on the day of his election as Pope, he comes out on the apostolic loggia, and what does he do? He remains quiet for a few moments, and then he says, "Buona sera." He says, "Good evening," to the large crowd that is gathered in the Piazza di San Pietro. And then he invites them to pray for him. He, as we know, opts to live in the Casa Santa Marta rather than the Apostolic Palace. So he doesn't live where popes have lived, at least since 1870, at the time of the formation of the State of Italy. Prior to that, they lived in what is called the Quirinale Palace, which is now occupied by the President of the State of Italy. But he chooses a non-luxurious place where he will meet ordinary people, priests, bishops, friends at the Vatican, or going to any of the dicasteries. So we have lunch with them. So these two things alone, in addition to the fact that unlike his immediate predecessors, the country he goes to as Pope first when he is elected is in fact to go to Lampedusa. He doesn't go to Argentina. In fact, he hasn't gone back to Argentina. He goes to Lampedusa because that's where the immigrants are. That's where those trying to escape the tyrannies of the northern continent of Africa, or the inequities, or a number of different other social political factors, are crossing the Mediterranean, imperiling their lives, and they need to be welcomed. Now, those alone are disruptive. Style in the Vatican, as in the Royal House of Windsor, just minor adjustments sends a powerful message. This is how institutions work. And so Francis disrupts our expectations of the papacy, disrupts our traditional understanding of the papacy as it is embodied in him as the Bishop of Rome. That's the other thing, very important to understand. He identifies himself always as the Bishop of Rome, not as the Supreme Pontiff, the Pontifex Maximus, the head of the State of Italy, Patriarch of the West, although that term was subsequently issued by Benedict XVI, servant of the servants of God, successor of Peter, Vicar of Christ, all of these titles. He goes only for the Bishop of Rome, because that's what he is. That's going to be the primary focus of his self-identification and of his pastoral leadership. These are acts of disruption that speak very clearly to style. But then there are the other disruptions, where he bypasses traditional canonical sanctions to deal with issues around annulments, just to give you one of many examples. He doesn't change doctrine. You know, I mean, the charge from many that he's heterodox, that he's problematic, that he's a heretic, this is ridiculous. These are charges as absurd as most of Trump's discourse. They're based on misperception at best. There is no evidence that he's changed any doctrine whatsoever, and there won't be, because he sees himself in terms as Peter, and the Petrine principle of unity in the church is critical to the exercise of that ministry. As you can appreciate, that raises all kinds of challenges, because people have expectations around how he exercises the papal office that perhaps are a little unrealistic. But the Pope as disruptor, that's the term And that's why I chose again. It's a very long-winded answer to your question. At this rate, we'll have 2 questions in the next hour and a half. But anyway, that's the response to the
Yeah,
first.
but there's a rich, thank you for really articulating the rich text here behind that disruptor, and for pointing out the difference between ER and OR disruptor. So Pope Francis very much a disruptor, as you've explained. Now the Jesuit part of it, the spiritual exercises define Jesuit identity, you write. This is Bergoglio's tradition, his spiritual framework. There's a strong evangelistic streak in Bergoglio's personality and spirituality. For him, one must be grounded in the now, attentive to the Spirit's disclosure in the present lived experience. The dynamic of the Spirit cannot be contained by rules, regulations, dogmas even. So how do you see the spirituality of this first Jesuit pope, a spirituality that draws on the Ignatian spiritual exercises reflected in the pastoral approach taken by Pope Francis?
The first thing I think in trying to place Bergoglio in the history of popes, or to try to better get a portal or open to understand his sensibility, is to appreciate exactly what you alluded to, Gary, in the spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises is a foundational document in Jesuit life. I remember many years ago working on an earlier book for Macmillan called The Jesuit Mystique, and I was interviewing an American Jesuit who was the dean of the Boston Law College, had chaired the impeachment committee of Nixon, was very well known as a jurist. And we were chatting about this, and I said, sometimes I get the impression that Jesuits, unlike many of the mendicant orders, the Dominicans, Franciscans, etc., just seem to be a congregation or a gathering together, if you like, of bachelors doing independent things. So what holds them together? He says, you've got it right. We very often are independent and we do our own thing. And even when we live in community, we don't live in community in the same way that many of the religious orders do. He says, what holds us together, the only thing that holds us together, the only thing that makes sense is the spiritual exercises. Taking the spiritual exercises, giving the spiritual exercises. Now, what are they about? Well, they're about discernment, the recognition of the importance of interiority. And they highlight very especially the role of the imagination. And this is going to be a feature of Francis's papacy that I think is very important. The role of the imagination in conceptualizing. In fact, just this summer, he issued a document specifically focused for those who are involved in Christian formation, underscoring the value of literature. He said, people who have become catechists, people who are in the seminaries and whatnot, they should be reading literature, should be part of the curriculum. Now, of course, he highlights writers that have particular appeal to him. Borges, obviously a fellow Argentine, but he also underscores the importance of the tragedians, Greek tragedians, and interestingly enough, Proust. He also showcased Eliot, T.S. Eliot, but it's not the poet. He showcased some prose work of Eliot's. It's not generally considered an important part of his canon. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is he showcases the role of the imagination as critical. In doing the exercises, of course, you were involved in the process of imagining or inserting yourself into biblical characters, trying to imagine the discourse, trying to place yourself in the context of a conversation with Jesus, the whole compositio loci, the creation of space, the composition of space or position, very important. Now, when you consider that for Francis, and I automatically drew this conclusion when I was covering the election with Lloyd Robertson, that the Francis he chose was Francis Xavier. Of course, I was wrong. It was Francesco de Bernardone. It was the other Francis, right? Because the Francis Xavier, of course, is the missionary. And if you look at the current spate of documents around the Synod, you'll see again and again he's talking about mission. He often talks about missionaries. He goes to mission territories. For God's sake, he just came back from Papua New Guinea. He was in Singapore, he was in Indonesia. He went to Mongolia, goes to places on the periphery, at the furthest reaches, the kinds of places that Francis Xavier would have gone to, in fact, did go to. That missionary consciousness is a pioneer consciousness, and it's, again, integral to understanding the Jesuit sensibility, spiritual and intellectual. You take risks. You go to the farthest reaches. You develop a commitment to God's greater glory. All of this, evangelization, missionary sensibility, the role of imagination in spiritual life, all of these are constitutive of the Jesuit sensibility as Francis understands them and as Francis lives them.
So, following up on that, you referred to the grounding in the now, attentive to the Spirit's disclosure in the present lived experience. Does this not place Francis in sort of contrast with some wings of the church? For example, the more dogmatic approach of some wings of the church?
He underscores again and again, frequently, to I'm sure the endless frustration of his detractors, that reality is more important than ideation. He's not an anti-rationalist. He is in his own way a serious thinker. But what he does is he identifies the now, the immediate, the enfleshed, the real, and prioritizes that over the abstract. You can see it in various documents that have been authorized by him coming from various of the dicasteries, talking about how theology should be done, how theology should be exercised. I had a very good conversation with a remarkable woman who is quoted at some length here in the book, by the name of Emily Tsukuda. And Emily Tsukuda is the director of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America. She's a fellow Argentine and a theologian, and she understands very well where Francis is coming from, and said, there was never any direct repudiation of the preferential option for the poor by the liberationists, although he was much more interested in developing a theology of the people with various minor variations. She said he's committed to the preferential option with the poor. And the change of the language, for to with, is characteristic of his communitarian, populist approach to things, that it's not a top-down, it's a bottom-up awareness. And part of that is very, very integral to understanding the Latin American theological movements, which are grounded in so many ways on conscientization, right? Bringing people to a new awareness, a new consciousness. The term originates with the great pedagogue Paulo Freire in Brazil, but it's been used in theological, philosophical, and other circumstances as well, bringing people to new awareness. It does seem to me that is what Francis is doing, he's succeeding in doing in some cases, and maybe not so much in other cases, because it's a complex remit. I mean, you're in charge of 1.4 billion people spread all over the planet, embedded in different cultures, different levels of understanding of Catholic teaching, and you have oversight over this massive structure. So expectations of what Francis can achieve, I think, sometimes fall short of the realistic. But what is important to understand is the momentum he's generated around this, and the setting the groundwork for the change of culture, which will produce the kind of changes many of us would like to see now, not later.
And as we continue to probe, what motivates Francis, you mentioned in your book several theologians and thinkers who have influenced him. I'll direct my question to just two of them. You refer to naturalized German thinker Romano Guardini as, quote, one of the persistent theological and philosophical influences of his life. And I also note the admiration that Pope Francis has for Thomas Merton as a moral prophet. So my question is, what aspects of the thinking and approaches of Guardini and Thomas Merton particularly influenced or resonated with Pope Francis?
In the case of Romano Guardini, one of the great figures of the Catholic Church, like Carl Adam, who actually preceded the council. So he's one of those figures that we often we leave to scholars and theologians to talk about, because they're not part of that grand array of celebratory figures that emerged through the council and at the time of the council. But Guardini was hugely influential in the background, and he combined not only a philosophical intelligence with a theological one. He was also deeply interested in narrative. One of his most famous works is a work simply called The Lord. And this was important for Bergoglio when he read him. But it wasn't that so much that he drew on as it was his humanism, his rejection of the technological paradigm that has now become dominant. He saw in Guardini a kind of a prophet for what happens when technology subverts the human in us in so many significant ways, whether ontological or practical or whatever. It was the dominance of the technological paradigm that was a special point of attraction for Bergoglio. Now, there is a link there, I think, Gary, with Merton. Merton wrote extensively about the encroachments of technology, or technologistic, differentiating between technology and technologism, by which he meant a particular kind of determinative mentality. And he drew heavily on the work of Hannah Arendt and on the Holocaust by simply talking about somebody like I'm just thinking of the commander, Adolf Eichmann, and the banality of evil and that kind of thing. The instrumentalist, highly controlled, amoral pragmatist who masters sophisticated technological systems and then deploys them to insidious and inhuman ends. This is a perduring theme in the writings and the thinking of Bergoglio, because he's constantly anxious about what is happening. It's not insignificant that he's the first pope to address the G7. He addresses the G7 in the context of artificial intelligence. So, I mean, he's on the cusp of many of these issues that he sees diminishing the essentially human. Part of this thinking comes from the critique that was provided philosophically by Guardini and provided spiritually, if you like, and and poetically through Merton. Merton also appeals to him because of the notion of unity of the contraries. And again, you can find it in a lot of his writing, Rosmini in particular, some of the other writers that he turns to and thinkers that Bergoglio turns to. It's the choreography of the tensions, the contraries. It's not eliminating one over the other. It's producing a new solution. He talks about this in terms of the dialectical struggles we sometimes have when we must find a new outpouring. It's not a matter of erasing, it's a matter of creating a new entity and understanding. It's not a matter of triumphing or disproving or scoring points. It's a matter in dialogue of actually coming to a new synthesis. So in Merton, you see this all the time. You see where, and I quote a couple of passages from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, in which Merton talks about taking Judaism, taking Buddhism, taking Taoism, taking Islam, taking various streams of Christianity outside of the Roman dispensation and saying, when I can incorporate and affirm these components in my own life as a Catholic, then I'm deeply enriched and I'm diminished when I do not do so. So as Merton looks at the challenges of pluralism, not as a threat on the horizon, but as an invitation to understand more deeply, so does Pope Francis. So in conversation with Muslim leaders, Shia and Sunni and others as well, Druze and others, in the same case in his conversation with the non-Catholic Christian community, he's always pushing, always seeking to understand. As the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, is a huge friend of Francis's. And I noticed that this year he's added 2 more leaders of international Christian groups, the Lutherans and the Mennonites, as well as the Pentecostal assemblies and the Eastern Rite traditions and whatnot, to the Synod. So he doesn't want the discussions to go at the Synod to be primarily tribal, or what he refers to as autoreferentiality, just simply a matter of talking about ourselves. We have to be open to that's the missionary thing again. We have to be open to the world. We can only be open to the world when we hear the world. And when we can only hear the world when we're prepared actually to listen. So if you look at the dynamic in the Bergoglio papacy, you will find a stunning consistency in which he identifies specifically what he sees as important in moving the church forward. Now, what often happens too is because he prefers spontaneity to scripted commentary, he can say all kinds of things and then he gets himself into all kinds of trouble, right? So, because he wants again to be able to respond spontaneously and not according to the text that an aide has given him. So I think these are all aspects of how Francis operates. It's his modus operandi, but he depends in no small part on his reading of Guardini, particularly his critique of technology, and an Merton's sense of bringing the contraries together to form a new vibrating, shimmering unity. And those things appeal to him.
Now, Pope Francis, thank you for that. Pope Francis is not only the first Jesuit Pope, but he is the first Pope, unless we go back to the 8th century, where there was a Pope from Syria, from a lived global South experience. And in 1900, 2/3 of Catholics lived in Europe. Now 2/3 of the 1.2 billion baptized Catholics live in the global South. As Massimo Fagioli noted about the Pope's recent trip to Asia and Oceania, the Pope Francis, there is no prospect of a re-Latinization or a new Romanization of global Catholicism. In the same vein, you wrote that Francis entertains no doubt that the Church's hitherto exclusive European provenance is no more. The Church is no longer the noble offspring of imperial Rome. The Church's sway and its future lie in the global South. So 2 questions flow from that for me. The first one is, how significant is it that Pope Francis is the first Pope, at least in modern history, who brings to the papacy a lived global South experience?
Well, you know, since the council from 1962 to 1965, which brought together the entire episcopate of the Catholic Church, we did not have any profound experience of the Church's universality. The previous council, the Vatican Council of 1869 to 1870, had a limited membership. So the opportunity provided by Pope John the 23rd to create a grand congregation of bringing together, and the council was a synod, bringing all the bishops together was unheard of. We have to go back several centuries, probably to the Council of Trent, and even there restricted in terms of global influence, global representation. So when it comes to Francis's synod, and when it comes to Francis himself, maybe that's what I should address first of all. So what happened with the congregations in Rome at the time of the election of Bergoglio? Well, first of all, one has to say that the pontificate of Benedict XVI was less than sterling. In fact, in my view, it was a failure. And this does not mean that Joseph Ratzinger was a failure. He was not. And he was a significant theologian. He did some incredibly important things in the life of the churches, especially in his thinking around liturgy, but many other matters as well. But as in terms of governance, in terms of oversight, in terms of credibility, in terms of meeting the pastoral demands that he inherited from a very epic and dramatic figure, Karol Wojtyła, he wasn't up to the task. He realized this, and there was a certain genius and a certain humility in his recognizing that the best thing to do was to remove himself from the scene. When he did this, and this was prefaced by several things, including the scandal around Vati leaks, the papers taken by his butler, the fact that he couldn't work with his own bishops in the German episcopate, the divisions that had surfaced around inappropriate initiatives with traditionalist bishops who had anti-Semitic legacies, to say nothing of the controversy around his address in Regensburg, in which he said some rather unnuanced though not historically inaccurate, but rather unnuanced comments about Islam. So on almost every front, Benedict was under siege. So when the bishops gathered in Rome, the cardinals, to elect his successor, one of the things they were looking for was somebody from outside the structure, outside the system. Somebody who you can't, I mean, it's very difficult to correct a management from within if you're one of the managers who's been implicated over decades of leadership. This is true in university life, it's true in corporate life, as you can see, it's true in banking, it's true in the government. So we shouldn't be surprised it's not also true in ecclesial life. So expecting significant internal reform from somebody who's been part of the system is a long shot. It's unrealistic, right? So there was an openness for somebody actually really coming from outside Europe. And there were other contenders, but Bergoglio had been around before. I mean, he was shortlisted last time, you want to use that phrase. So he was not unknown, right? They have what are called, I think it was Benedict who instituted these, although it may have, no, I think it was Benedict who instituted them, these congregations where various cardinals give their view, if you like, about what needs to happen in the church. And other cardinals elector listen to this, and it helps them to form judgments that are appropriate in terms of their own decision making. Francis comes out of this elected. He comes out of it elected because in part he's not part of the system. He didn't graduate from any of the Roman pontifical universities. He never worked in Rome. He's never part of the Vatican machinery. And although he would have had appointments, titular appointments, sitting on some of the senior dicasteries or congregations, by and large, he was a rare visitor to the site. So he was really unknown. He was unknown. And they listened to what he had to say. They understood the shift to the global south in terms of Catholic composition. They realized that maybe this was the right time and reform could be effected by somebody who was actually untouched by the curial structure itself. They were right in that. And he did that. He changed the curia. What they didn't understand was this was only the beginning. He was not stopping with changing or reforming the curia. He had other things in mind, a general reform of the church itself. So I think that's where the collision comes, where they say, well, you know, we needed him to clean house. Well, he did kind of clean house, not completely. There are still some outstanding controversies, but he did a lot of what was expected of him. But it was much broader than that. His vision, his ecclesial vision is much broader than that. So it wasn't limited to that. So that's where I think he's taken this. But can I go back to the original question, Gary? Because now I've kind of forgotten. Yes.
Well, actually, the linked question is, what do you see as the foreseeable impacts of the evolving sway of the church in the global south?
Oh, in the global south, yes. Well, I think it's significant on several fronts. Let me give you some examples. And it's not just a matter of numbers. In Latin America, the Catholic growth in Africa probably is proportionately greater than it is in Latin America. The growth in many Latin American constituencies is among non-Catholic Pentecostal Free Church Assembly groups. They seem to be the growth area. And it's very interesting that Francis is the first major prelate that I've come across anyway, who doesn't see them as the enemy. There have been concerns for many years about the ingrowth of evangelical Pentecostal groups coming into the Latin American continent, which has been hegemonically Catholic, whether the Portuguese part, Brazil, or the Spanish part. It was always seen as the Catholic kingdom. That hasn't been the case for quite some time. You can look at Guatemala as one example, but there are many others as well. So the Francis didn't look at this as an incursion to be resisted, but as a challenge to be met. So he befriended the Pentecostals and the people from the more conservative, evangelical Christian communities, rather than seeing them as the enemy. He sees them as collaborators in mission. And you see a perfect example of that in Rome. Like every day, at the end of the day, at 2:30, 2:15 or whatnot, we were supposed to have a press conference in Rome at the last synod. Well, it's Italian time, so it's 2:15, but it could really be 3 or 3:30 or whatever. But you just have to stay there, and they come in and they bring in representatives from the synod. So they're synod delegates. So they would be bishops, archbishops, cardinals, lay women, a lot of lay women theologians, very articulate lay men and whatnot. And they would compose the sometimes 6, maybe 7, 5 representatives each day. So that's pretty well every day, 6 days a week, largely of these. And they were different. They weren't the same people. They were different people. And they would come and they would respond to questions from reporters, journalists, and academics who were in the Senate hall, in the hall of the Stampa della Santa Sede, which is the press office of the Holy See. And make themselves available. And I thought wonderfully. So I've covered several synods, and I found their openness and their frankness to be particularly commendable, especially since they were told largely not to talk to the press, because Francis restructured the dynamic of the synod delegates, what they could say and how they could immerse themselves in the spirituality of the exercise. But here was the important point. On one occasion, they had representatives of different churches. And right in the middle of it was this young Afro-American dressed in a white suit. Most of them were dressed in dark suits and black or whatever. He's dressed in white. He stood right out. And he was the head of the Pentecostal assemblies of the United States. This is the first time I've ever seen anything like this, because usually representation from Christian communities is from mainstream. So you expect the Methodists and the Anglicans and the United Church in the States or something like that, but you don't, Presbyterians, but you don't expect the Pentecostals to be seen. There he was, just thrilled with the fact that he's there and he's able to participate in this important ecumenical event or ecumenical moment. That's Francis, and it does seem to me that it's illustrative of the fact that in building a greater Christian communion, he sees Christian division as lamentable, and of course he's working, he's an ecumenist at heart, working to build unity. He thinks this is very important, but he's not going to leave anybody out. He's going to bring in the larger family. And that seems to me to be representative of the way he looks at the Latin American continent in terms of the growth of the conservative Christian sector, and how you bring it in, not ostracize it, not treat it as a pariah, but how you make it part of a deeper communion. Similarly, when you look at his theology of the peripheries, part of which he draws, or which I shouldn't say draws on, but receives significant support from the Synergidial movement in Rome, which was founded by Andrea Riccardi, who is a philosophy professor, still alive, at I think the Sapienza at the University of Rome. And he this is probably the largest, most significant progressive lay Catholic movement in the world. And Francis is drawn to its spirituality and drawn to its theology of dealing with the poor, the marginalized, those in war-torn regions. Because if you look at the work of the Synergidial movement in helping to solve the crisis in Mozambique and Angola, or a couple of decades ago, you can see it was a wonderful model or a template that he himself uses in his efforts to resolve current war conflicts, which hasn't been, quite frankly, successful at all. But nonetheless, this is the template that he's deploying. So the concern with the marginalized, the concern with the poor, the concern with incorporating various Christian denominations in a common project of humanizing and bringing peace and equity to the world, which might not, for some Catholics, seem to be something a pope should be concerned about, but this pope is very much concerned with. You begin to recognize that that global South experience is formative for him. It's not decorative. It's not an add-on. It's not like, well, some prelates who rise in the Vatican in various dicasterial positions. They go over there, they're there, and then the next thing you know, they're pro-prefects, and then they're prefects or heads. He's changed the nomenclature. We don't even use the same nomenclature anymore. So now he's the head of a dicastery. And so he's a career dicasterial cardinal. This is his job. Francis really works to internationalize that component, to have representatives from across the continent in order to enrich the sensibility. Because I'll stop here, but here's a perfect example of it. Years ago, working with a colleague of mine on the official biography of Cardinal Carter of Toronto, who was an eminent, influential Canadian churchman in his time. And we were in Rome, meeting with various individuals who knew him in the Holy Office or any number of the other departments or congregations. And on one occasion, we were in the Vatican Library. And because the then librarian, Leonard Boyle, was an Irish Canadian Dominican who had been teaching at the Pontifical Institute for Medieval Studies for many years and was a well-known paleographer. So we had some time with him when we were there. And as I came in, I found it was kind of a crowded area he was in. And I was stepping over this young student. And there were all these marvelous drafts on the floor. And I said, what exactly is going on here? And he said, oh, this introduced me to her. She was finishing her graduate degree in fine arts at the University of Mannheim. She was working with some very early drafts of Michelangelo. So I was stepping over these drafts right there on the floor. And I said, it's extraordinary here. He says, yes, history stops here. He said, you know, they think in centuries. So that's why when sometimes we, especially in North America and Europe, want an immediate response shaped by our cell phone experience. We say, well, Rome should respond, but this is not how it thinks. This is not, if you could meet one of the officials and said, oh yes, we addressed this issue in 1451. We'll be coming back to it later. I mean, there is just a significant time structure or mentality that is unique to the way the Roman system operates. Again, this is another disruptive aspect because Francis comes in and he doesn't like to wait. I mean, you can see it when he's in ceremony. Yep. We had a concluding liturgy at the synod, and they moved it inside the basilica. The opening liturgy was outside in the piazza. The inside was the concluding liturgy, and it takes an eternity to get all the bishops in from wherever they're coming from. They get them all in there. And Francis comes in earlier. He doesn't process at the end because now he's in a wheelchair. So they bring him in and then they move him to his seat and whatnot. So he's sitting there waiting for this endless procession. And he turns to an aide in the procession. Most of them were in by this point. He turns to an aide and I was in an alcove some distance, but I could figure out what he must have been saying because you could see the anxiety among the journalists. He tells them, let's get the show on the move. What are we waiting for? Let's move here. So they move, and there's a German videographer standing beside me who's horrified at this because the Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcasting system, is like all the other public broadcasting systems tied to a specific framework. So they needed this time. They can't start 9 minutes or 10 minutes before. They have to start here. So there was a lot of panic there. And I thought, this is classic Francis. Here's the form. Here's the structure. Here's the way we do things. And then Francis says, well, why don't we do it differently?
Can I interrupt you there? Sorry.
Okay. Long-winded answer.
Yes, I want to get to some of the more contemporary issues. And so one of them that Pope Francis recently stated with regard to gays, in life, God accompanies persons, and we must accompany them starting from their situation. And it is necessary to accompany them with mercy. So my question is, has Pope Francis effectively moved the needle in any way on the Church's official approach, specifically with regard to people who identify as LGBTQ?
Yes, I think he has. And this is one of the reasons why there's a fair degree of anxiety in various quarters in the church that see this as a threatening development in Christian life. But it's a gentle move. It's not a radical shift. In Francis's thinking, if we can think through the prism of mercy, we can eschew judgment. If we put judgment on hold, and we see our primary portal to understanding the other, and always reverencing the other. If we reverence the other, then the other questions will fall into place. So the philosophical, anthropological, and theological, they have their role. They need to be addressed, yes. But the primary portal of entry is mercy. You stand before the other and you don't judge. You will remember that was his response to a question that was directed to him when he was flying back from one of his papal visits. And he said, "Who am I to judge?" Now, this wasn't a flippant response. It was a response grounded in scripture. Our job, or my job, is not to judge. It is to understand, and it is to respect, and it is to love. And the channel in which that can be best realized, of course, is mercy. This again doesn't mean that the attendant questions around biblical anthropology, ontology, all the kinds of things that philosophers and theologians get themselves worked up about, and understandably, it means that their status in his mind is secondary. What is primary is witness. What is primary is mercy. Let me give you just one example here, because I know I'm taking a fair bit of time responding to your questions here. At the Synod in Rome, there was a lot of trepidation in some circles that the question around ministry to, ministry of, ministry for LGBTQS people was not being taken seriously enough, was not being addressed with any kind of force in the Synod Hall. There were no statements about it. It was not a part of the synthesis report. So, well, these are going on. They did right. The questions came up not infrequently in the press conferences, I can assure you. So, and there would be quite significant debate among the reporters, if not the panelists. But what was important to understand was I was sitting among a group of English-speaking journalists who self-identify as Catholic gay journalists. They work within a particular ministry. It could be New Ways Ministry. It could be some attendant ministry in communications technology, whatever. But that was part of their presence there, and they made it fairly clear. They were welcomed. They were welcome, but they often felt slightly isolated, even within the context of other reporters and journalists. At one point, Francis does something that, it's illustrative of style, true, but it says something about substance. What he does is he's been in correspondence with Janine Gramick, who was an American nun and co-founder with Robin Nugent of New Ways Ministries in the 1970s, had a particular charge or remit to work with gay Catholics. That had a troubled history with Pope John Paul II, but even more so with Pope Benedict. And Nugent was required to pull out. Janine Gramick switched orders. She left the School of Sisters of Notre Dame and she joined the Loretta Sisters. She continued to work. Well, lo and behold, we find out Francis has a correspondence with her. Not only does he correspond with her privately, he invites her to Rome. So she comes to Rome, and he has a video moment when he has some of these representatives from New Ways Ministry and the journalists I've been talking about, and he's standing there with them. This is rare. Nobody else got these video moments, special video moments. And it's a sign of saying, look, we can't raise this particular issue in the way you would like right now. Okay, but I want to make it abundantly clear that I stand in solidarity with you. And so that special moment seemed to me to send a very strong message that many journalists got. They picked this up pretty quickly. So I think that when you look at Francis and how he wrestles with this issue, it's very complex, but the strategy in the end is fundamentally pastoral. But you also have to consider that he's 87. He comes from Latin America. He's been shaped by a specific kind of mentality, which has not been untouched by machismo. So, there are many ways in which Francis's view of anywhere from echoing John Paul II's theory of complementarity to the role of women seems archaic, anachronistic, restrictive. That's a legitimate view. It's important, however, to contextualize it. Who is he? What shaped this? And what are the priorities? And the priority is always pastoral. And at the heart of that pastoral priority is understanding. If you understand and reverence the other, you move forward. I think that's the major contribution to the change in church culture that he's inaugurated.
Okay, and this is probably my last question, although I have several others, but I did want to ask this one. Pope Francis previously created two commissions to study women deacons, first in 2016 and in 2020, but we've seen no action on that. However, he has opened spaces to women's participation and leadership that didn't previously exist, for example, at the Vatican Curia. So there are two questions that flow from that. How do you interpret his position on the ordination of women to the diaconate? And then secondly, in terms of opening up spaces, as he did on the Curia, are these changes likely to outlive him and become permanent features?
Well, on the first question, yes, there were two commissions that have established. Yes, those reports are not known. He's not responded to either of the recommendations, whatever they were. Part of that appears to be what we've been able to divine is that there is no consensus. Francis won't move until he has some consensus. So part of that is built into a certain need of caution on his part about what the implications are for the universal church. What could be true for the church in the United States and Canada will not be true for the church in Sudan and in Indonesia and in Melanesia. In other words, he has to, on any matter that even broaches the doctrinal, he has to move with extreme caution, and of course, most likely convoke a council. But the issue I think that many people have around this is that if you establish these commissions and you appoint these specialists and you don't actually disclose what was revealed or discussed, then it puts on hold, it calls into question your commitment to transparency and synodality. That's a legitimate criticism, frankly. But here's a complicated factor in all of this. I'm not trying to skirt the question. I think the question is an important one, and we'll see if it resurfaces at the second session of the synod, and it may. He has delegated a number of the controversial and contentious issues to specific study groups, 10 specific study groups that have been set up to deal with these issues. And they have a responsibility of reporting to him by June of 2025. They also have a responsibility to give an interim report to the synod. So we'll get a sense of what's going on here. What I see going on in a parallel way, and this is of some significance in terms of my analysis of what is going on, is that Francis has become increasingly vocal in his criticism of seminary formation. There were only a couple of occasions of intervention. I think there were 3 interventions at the synod that he made himself, and 2 of them were specifically around ecclesiastical careerism, clericalism, and particularly on notions of exceptionalism, the fascination they have with ecclesiastical vesture. In fact, he makes a big point about this at one point in one of the interventions. He's also met with seminary rectors, junior seminary rectors. I didn't even know there were junior seminaries anymore, but he met with some of them, and he's met with major seminary rectors. He's made it very clear he's unhappy with the formation that's occurring. Okay, and then he's not unlike some of the bishops worldwide, and indeed some rectors who are similarly unhappy with what they're dealing with. My view is that this is tinkering, and that the problem is in the seminary structure itself. The seminary is a product of the Counter-Reformation. This is the 21st century. It's not working anymore. It's an incubation period for clericalism. In my view, it needs to be dissolved. We need to, we're a large church. We're quite capable of thinking of new ways of doing things. It does seem to me, before we get to the point of opening up the diaconate and the presbyterate to women, we need to clean up what we mean by the presbyterate and the diaconate and how we train people. Otherwise, we're going to end up training people into a clerical structure that has become itself the greatest threat to the presbyterate itself. Now, you got to remember that clericalism is not new. In fact, one of the first speeches given at the first session of the Second Vatican Council was given by Bishop de Smet of Bruges in Belgium, in which he denounced the sin of clericalism. We've been denouncing the sin of clericalism for decades now, and it became, of course, exacerbated by the shocking sexual abuse disclosures that began in the 80s and just doesn't appear to end. and it's one of the reasons why the Germans have their own synod, right? So we're dealing with the sexual abuse issue isn't a minor issue. It is a deep pathological problem. Now, how do you deal with this if you only end up tinkering with some of the responses? And it does seem to me that that's a weakness in the Bergoglio papacy, that he identifies the problem of clericalism. He sees the damage that it does, but he doesn't go to the next step to say, well, we have to rethink how we do this. What do we mean by the presbyterate? The priesthood is indispensable, obviously, to Catholic life. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about the priesthood shorn of its clerical dimensions, right? And so I think that actually is a deeper, more important question than the ordination of women to the diaconate and the presbyterate right now. I think we need to address that issue first.
Well, this is a good place to end this part of the conversation. Michael, thank you very much for your very thoughtful answers to the questions. I hope that this conversation has encouraged people to read your book, which and you will find, as I did, you'll find your book really very helpful in understanding the Bergoglio papacy. So at this point, I would just hand back over to Christine so we can get some questions from the rest of the participants.